Standard panels are doing exactly the job that they were built to do, which is to catch a disease. They were never built to tell you whether you're operating anywhere close to your ceiling or what diseases may be coming in the future. So if you walked away from your last physical with a clean bill of health, but you still don't feel like you're operating at your best, that gap right there is exactly what these markers are built to close.
Welcome to Health Decoded, your number one source for real health information, with your hosts, Dr. Alessi and Matt Tack.
So you just got your annual physical, your blood work came back normal, and your doctor shook your hand and said, see you next year, everything's fine. But why do you still hit the wall at 2 p.m. every single day? Why does the recovery from your bad night's sleep take you longer than it used to? Why is the number on the scale the same as 5 years ago, but you look and you feel different? Well, here's the problem, and I want to be precise about this because this is the whole episode basically in one sentence. The standard physical is built to catch disease. It is not built to measure performance. And those are two different jobs. A normal fasting glucose tells your doctor you don't have diabetes right now. It tells you almost nothing about whether your metabolic engine is running efficiently, whether you're inflamed, whether your cardiovascular risk is quietly climbing. The panel your insurance covers is basically a floor. It's not a ceiling. And if you're a high performer or someone whose job depends on cognitive output, stamina, and decision-making under pressure, the floor is not the number you should be optimizing to. So today I'm giving you the 5 categories of biomarkers that never make it onto a standard panel, but why each one matters specifically if you're operating at an executive level, and what we actually do with the data once we have it. This isn't a go ask your doctor list. This is what we run at Ascend and exactly why we do that. So let's get right into it. So start here because this is the clearest example of normal not being optimal. Lipids. Your standard lipid panel gives you 4 numbers, basically total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, and triglycerides. Your doctor will look at the LDL, he'll see it's under 130, maybe under 100 if you're being careful, and tell you that you're fine. But here's what that panel doesn't tell you. How many particles are carrying that cholesterol and how small and dense they are. This matters because cardiovascular risk isn't driven by how much cholesterol is floating in your blood. It's driven by how many particles are available to lodge into your arterial walls and start the inflammatory cascade that eventually becomes plaque. Think of it less like a fuel gauge and more like a traffic count. LDL cholesterol tells you the total volume of cargo being shipped. It doesn't tell you how many trucks are on the road. You can have a totally normal LDL number and still have a high particle count because your cholesterol is being packed into large number of small, dense particles instead of fewer, larger ones. So 2 patients with an identical LDL of 110 can have wildly different actual risk. One might have 900 particles, the other 1,400. Same cargo, total, twice the trucks on the road, twice the opportunity for something to go wrong at an intersection. So that panel can't tell them apart, but an APOB can. So APOB, which is apolipoprotein B, is a direct count of the atherogenic particles, LDL, VLDL, ILDL, LPA, one number, and it is far better predictor of cardiovascular events than LDL cholesterol alone. This has been argued in cardiology for over a decade. It's increasingly recognized as the more accurate measure, even if it's still catching on in mainstream primary care. But it's still not on the standard panel. Most of you are getting once a year. So why is that? And here's why this is specifically important. If you're running a company or you run a team or you're somebody who needs to perform, cardiovascular events, they do not announce themselves. And we've all heard stories of people who seemingly are healthy and their doctors say they're fine and then they have a heart attack. There's no meeting on your calendar for this. There's not a warning sign. The first sign of a heart attack is often the heart attack itself. And so the people who show up in the cardiologist's office with an event in their 50s, they overwhelmingly, these people had what would be called normal cholesterol on paper the year before. Not because the disease appeared overnight, but because nobody was measuring the marker that would actually have shown it developing. And so if you're an executive, if you're in your 40s or 50s with a family, if you have history of heart disease in your family, or you've had a normal lipid panel for a decade and you would actually want to know your risk, APOB is the single highest value number that you're not getting. It actually costs almost nothing to add to a panel. It's just one more tube of blood. Run this alongside everything else you're already getting drawn, and it can completely change the risk picture of your current cholesterol numbers and sometimes reassure you when the picture looked worse than it is. Because sometimes doing the opposite, telling you to take action before a standard panel, would have said anything. Okay, so here's the next one. This is the one that I want you to pay close attention to because it's the marker most directly tied to the one thing you're actually probably here for, which is being able to perform or optimize your health. So energy, the 2 p.m. wall. Standard panels are going to check fasting glucose. That's it. Glucose is a lagging indicator. By the time it's elevated, the problem has usually been developing for years. So here's the mechanism, and I want to walk through it slowly because once you understand this, you'll actually never look at normal glucose the same. When you eat, especially carbohydrate-heavy food, your blood sugar rises and your pancreas releases insulin to move that glucose out of your bloodstream and into your cells, where it gets used for fuel. In a metabolically healthy person, that process is efficient. A modest amount of insulin does the job. Glucose comes back down cleanly and the system resets. In someone who's developing insulin resistance, the cells stop responding as well to insulin's signal. The receptors on the cell surface become less sensitive, so the pancreas compensates the only way it knows how, by producing more insulin to force the same amount of glucose into the cells. And because that compensation works, at least for a while, glucose stays in normal range. The extra insulin is doing the heavy lifting. But you're now running a system under load that used to run without strain. And that compensation has a cost that doesn't show up on the marker that anyone's actually measuring. This is why fasting insulin and the calculated ratio, which we call the HOMA-IR, which combines fasting glucose and fasting insulin into a single index, catches the problem years, sometimes even a decade before glucose does. Optimal fasting insulin is under 8 micro-IU per ml. We regularly see executive high performers, people with no visible weight problem, glucose sitting at a comfortable 90, with like a fasting insulin of like 15 or 18 or even sometimes higher, telling us that their pancreas is working overtime to keep that glucose looking normal on paper. But nobody's measuring the thing doing the compensating because it was never part of the panel. So here's why this matters. If you're sitting in back-to-back meetings, if you live on coffee, if you live on adrenaline, insulin resistance doesn't just predict future type 2 diabetes, which is the framing most people have heard and mentally filed under like, someday, this is not my problem right now. It's directly tied to the energy crash you feel mid-afternoon, the brain fog that you get in a 4 p.m. meeting, the carb-heavy lunch that leaves you foggy and reaching for a second coffee instead of feeling fueled and sharped. Your cells, including the ones in your brain, are becoming progressively less efficient at taking up glucose for fuel. That's the biology behind the thing you've been chalking up to as just stress or getting older or needing more sleep. It's not that you're undisciplined, and it's not something you're going to be able to caffeinate your way out of for a long term. It's a measurable, correctable metabolic signal that your annual physical never looked for because it never ran the test that would have found it. The third thing, inflammation. And these are the inflammation markers that you can't even feel. You don't know this is building. 2 markers here in specific, HSCRP, which is high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and homocysteine. Neither hurts. Neither shows up as a symptom that you would bring to the doctor. Both are quietly correlated with accelerated cardiovascular and cognitive decline. So HSCRP is a marker of systemic low-grade inflammation, not the kind of inflammation from a sprained ankle where you're going to see it, feel it, watch it resolve in a few weeks. It's the kind of smoldering, low-level inflammation that's going on at all times from things like visceral fat in the abdominal region, from chronic stress physiology, poor sleep, gut permeability, or food sensitivity. Optimal would be under 1 milligram per liter. And a lot of healthy executives who are healthy on paper with a good diet, exercise, They have no obvious red flags, are sitting at around a 2 or a 3 or even higher. And so I want to spend a minute on why specifically, because this is the piece that's most relevant to you and most commonly missed. Chronic occupational stress doesn't just feel bad. It has a direct inflammatory signature. When cortisol is chronically elevated or elevated at the wrong times of day because sleep and stress have disrupted your normal rhythm, your immune system's regulatory signals are going to become disrupted. Cortisol is supposed to help keep inflammation in check, but under chronic stress, the tissues that respond to cortisol become less sensitive to it. Similar to what we talked about earlier with insulin resistance a few minutes ago. Except this time it's the hormone that's supposed to be dialing inflammation down that stops getting heard. The result is a baseline inflammatory state that has nothing to do with your diet and everything to do with the way you manage your calendar. This is the piece that people miss because you can be doing a lot of things right on the nutrition side and still be inflamed because the driver isn't your food. It's your cortisol curve and the sleep debt that you've created. So why does this matter beyond inflammation is bad? Well, chronic low-grade inflammation is now understood to be one of the core mechanisms behind accelerated vascular aging. It's actually part of how the arterial plaque forms and progresses. And increasingly, it's implicated in cognitive decline as well, though effects on the blood-brain barrier unpause. And increasingly, it's implicated in cognitive decline as well, through effects on the blood-brain barrier and neuroinflammatory process that will track with long-term changes in memory and processing speed. This is a leading indicator. It's not a symptom you'll notice until the downstream event happens, such as a cardiac event or the cognitive change, and no one can attribute to just getting older. The next piece that we talked about was homocysteine, an amino acid byproduct that when it's elevated is independently associated with cardiovascular risk and is tied to how efficiently your body is running methylation. Methylation is a biochemical process that touches an enormous range of downstream function: detoxification pathways, neurotransmitter production, DNA repair. So elevated homocysteine is often a signal of a B vitamin insufficiency or possibly a genetic methylation inefficiency, both of which are easily correctable once you know they're there, and both of which are completely invisible on a standard panel that never checks for them. Neither of these two markers, HSCRP or homocysteine, will ever generate a symptom that sends you to urgent care. That's exactly why they matter, because that silent, measurable, and pause. That's exactly why they matter. Silent, measurable, and by the time they become a felt problem, you've lost the years where correcting course was easiest and cheapest. Next, hormones. If your physical checked hormones at all, it probably checked one number, maybe total testosterone or estrogen. That number alone tells you almost nothing useful, and here's why. Testosterone in your blood exists in two functional states, bound and free. Bound testosterone is attached to proteins, primarily sex hormone binding globulin, or what we call SHBG. And in that bound state, it is not biologically active. It can't do anything at the receptor level. What actually matters is free testosterone, the small fraction that's unbound and available to your tissues. Along with SHBG itself, estradiol, and in a generally thorough panel, thyroid markers that go beyond just TSH that include free T3, free T4, because TSH alone can't actually look normal while actual thyroid hormone conversion and availability are impaired. So a man can have normal total testosterone and functionally low free testosterone because SHBG is elevated, often driven by factors like chronic stress, liver function, age-related changes, which bind up the hormone that would otherwise be doing the work. That distinction is the difference between a doctor telling you you're fine and you actually knowing why you feel flat, unmotivated, or like your recovery from training has slowed for no obvious reason. Then there's body composition, and this is where I want to correct something almost everyone gets wrong. Your weight is not a leading indicator. Weight is actually a lagging one. Two people can weigh the same, wear the same size, have a completely different risk profile depending on where their weight is actually distributed. This is where a DEXA, or dual energy X-ray absorptiometry test, earns its place. It doesn't just give your body fat percentage. It separates visceral fat, which is around the organs, metabolically active fat that directly drives inflammation and insulin signaling. It doesn't delineate that from subcutaneous fat, which is the fat under the skin that is comparatively metabolically, inert. It also gives you your lean mass, and lean mass is one of the strongest predictors we have of long-term metabolic resilience, functional independence, healthy aging, because muscle isn't just about strength, it's your body's largest reservoir for glucose disposal, meaning the more lean mass directly supports insulin sensitivity that we just talked about a few minutes ago. So two executives at the same weight and the same BMI can have wildly different visceral fat and lean mass numbers, and therefore wildly different actual risk. One might be carrying most of that weight as muscle with some moderate visceral fat. The other person might be at the same number on the scale with high visceral fat and a comparatively low lean mass. The scale can't see that difference. BMI can't read that either. BMI is just basically a height to weight ratio, by the way, and it has no idea what tissue is actually making up that weight. The DEXA scan can see it and see it precisely. This is the category where most people are surprised because you could be lifting 3 days a week, eating reasonably well, showing a normal BMI, and still be carrying visceral fat that's driving that exact inflammatory and metabolic picture we just spent the last few minutes talking about. It all connects. None of these four categories are isolated. They're four windows into the same underlying system. And now what we actually do with this data is very important because getting a number is cool, but it's pointless unless you know what to do with it. A number with no action attached to it is just going to become anxiety. So let me walk you through how this actually plays out. And I want to be upfront about something first. The case I'm about to describe is a composite. It's not a specific patient. It's basically a pattern that we see over and over, blended into like a single picture, for example. And so I'm using it to show you how these pieces connect, not to hand you a protocol for yourself. That part still requires actually running your own numbers and having a physician walk through this with you. So just to be clear, this is for illustration only. This is not medical advice for your specific situation. My listeners know that by now. Your own protocol would depend entirely on your own labs, history, and an evaluation. But if any of this sounds like you, the next step would likely be testing, not a self-diagnosis. So here's a picture. Picture this. A mid-40s executive person comes in after completely clean annual physical. My doctor said everything was good. My glucose is normal. My cholesterol is acceptable. The doctor told me he would just report with me next year. But this person has this constant daily wall that they hit around 2 to 3 p.m. They feel like they're not recovering from sleep. They feel like their weight has slightly been gaining, even though they're working out harder than they have ever before. On paper, this is fine, but in the room, they don't feel fine. And so what we do, we run a panel that we talked about. APOB comes back elevated, even though their LDL was comfortably sitting in the range of a standard panel. The particle count tells a different risk story than the cholesterol number did. Years of quietly elevated cardiovascular risk that a doctor would have no reason to flag because the doctor wasn't looking at that in the first place. Next is a fasting insulin, comes back at like a 17. Glucose was a 91, which would have been completely unremarkable. But the 17 tells us that the pancreas has been compensating for a while. That's the mechanism behind that 2 p.m. crash. The cells are less efficient at taking up glucose, including the brain. HSCRP comes back at a 2.4, well above the optimal 1.0 target. Diet's reasonable. The driver here is almost always the existing chronic stress, chronic undersleeping, a stress hormone curve that never fully resets, which drives inflammatory signaling independent of what's on someone's plate. And then a DEXA scan shows visceral fat that's elevated, lean mass adequate but not increasing. So weight gain that looked minor on the scale is actually concentrated in exactly the tissue that's most tied to the insulin and inflammation findings from above. Same root cause, 4 different numbers. That's the part I want you to sit with because these 4 findings aren't 4 separate problems. They're one metabolic picture showing up in 4 places. The protocol that follows isn't just fix the ApoB, then fix insulin, then fix CRP as like 4 separate projects. It's targeted resistance training, restructured eating, within a window to rebuild sensitivity to insulin, which improves the visceral fat picture, which lowers the inflammatory load, alongside specific nutritional support and where may be warranted direct treatment for the particle count. One coordinated protocol because one underlying pattern produced all of the 4 numbers. That's the difference between functional medicine and just conventional medicine. A result with no interpretation attached to it is not useful, no matter how sophisticated the test that generated it. A result connected to other 3 results with a plan built around the pattern instead of each marker targeted in isolation, that's what changes trajectory. And I'd point out, none of this required any guessing. Every step in the protocol maps directly back to a specific number. That's the whole difference between optimization and generic advice. Generic advice is eat better, sleep more, manage your stress. Although that's true, it's basically useless because it doesn't tell you which lever matters the most for your physiology. A real panel will tell you exactly where to spend your limited time and attention. So let's bring it all together. 5 categories that your annual physical almost certainly did not check. 1. Advanced lipid markers, specifically APOB, instead of stopping at total cholesterol and LDL. 2. Fasting insulin and HOMAIR instead of just glucose. 3. HSCRP and homocysteine, the inflammation that you can't feel until it's already cost you some years. 4. A full hormone panel, not just total testosterone, plus a DEXA scan for real body composition instead of a number on a scale. Every one of these is measurable right now with existing validated tests, and none of this is experimental or fringe. Every one of these, when it's off, has a specific actionable next step attached to it. It's not a vague eat better, move more advice that leaves you exactly where you started. So here's the test I'd give you to walk away with. If you've had a physical this year, pull the results back up and ask yourself honestly, did it check for any of these 5? For almost everyone listening, the answer is probably no. That's not a failure of your doctor. Standard panels are doing exactly the job that they were built to do, which is to catch a disease. They were never built to tell you whether you're operating anywhere close to your ceiling or what diseases may be coming in the future. So if you walked away from your last physical with a clean bill of health, but you still don't feel like you're operating at your best, that gap right there is exactly what these markers are built to close. If you're ever interested, links in the show notes if you want to see what a comprehensive panel actually looks like. Thank you again for tuning in to Health Decoded. I'm Dr. Alessi. And if this was valuable, please share this with someone who needs to hear it. That's how we're able to help more people and spread the word of functional health. Dr. Alessi, I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for tuning in to Health Decoded, where we break down the truth about all things health and empower you to take charge of your well-being. If you found value in today's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. For more resources, personalized support, or to have your questions answered live on the show, visit Ascend Functional Health and head to the contact page to connect with us directly. Until next time, stay curious, stay empowered, and remember, your health is in your hands.